Picture this: a man with zero charisma somehow becomes one of the most powerful podcasters on earth. He sits across from presidents, tech billionaires, and world leaders while millions hang on his every word, believing he's some kind of genius academic from MIT. But what if I told you that almost everything about Lex Fridman's public persona is a carefully constructed lie?
Welcome, everyone.
Let's start with the foundational lie that everything else is built on. When you hear Lex Fridman, the first thing that comes to mind is probably MIT researcher or MIT professor. This association isn't accidental. It's been meticulously crafted through years of calculated deception. Here's what actually happened. Lex taught exactly one non-credit, after-hours community education class at MIT. Not during the semester, not for actual students, not for grades, and certainly not as faculty. This was a community outreach program that MIT offers to the general public. Literally anyone with basic qualifications can volunteer to teach these classes. The genius of this deception lies in its technical truthfulness. Yes, Lex taught at MIT in the most literal sense possible, but the implication he's created is that he was a respected faculty member at one of the world's most prestigious institutions. This is like someone claiming they worked for the Pentagon when they delivered pizza there once. The psychological manipulation is sophisticated. He's exploiting most people's inability to distinguish between different types of academic affiliations. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Lex has systematically erased his actual educational background. He earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Drexel University, a perfectly respectable institution that any normal person would be proud to claim. But Drexel doesn't carry the same prestige weight as MIT, so Lex has literally scrubbed it from his online presence. His LinkedIn says MIT, his papers cite MIT affiliations, and if you try to mention Drexel on his social media, you'll be blocked faster than you can say academic fraud. This isn't just misleading, it's pathological. Normal people don't completely erase their actual education to maintain a lie about teaching one community class. This suggests a level of calculated deception that goes far beyond simple resume padding. Lex has constructed an entirely false academic identity, and he's defended it with the kind of information control you'd expect from a cult leader, not an academic. The visual manipulation is equally calculated. That photo he uses everywhere, you know, the one with all the complex mathematical equations behind him? Those weren't his equations. He literally walked into a classroom where someone else had written on the blackboard and posed for photos. It's the intellectual equivalent of stolen valor, and he's used that image to fool millions of people into believing he's some kind of mathematical genius. But the MIT lie was just the setup for something much worse.
It makes for a fun chat, I think. So one guy that I've talked to several times, who's slowly becoming a friend, is a guy named Elon Musk.
Lex's real breakthrough came when he wrote a paper analyzing Tesla's autopilot safety data. On the surface, this sounds like legitimate academic work. The reality is far more sinister. This paper was never peer-reviewed, never published in an academic journal, and was so fundamentally flawed that actual experts in autonomous vehicle safety called it incorrect, biased, and misleading to the point of negligence. Let me repeat that. Experts didn't just disagree with his conclusions, they said his methodology was so bad it bordered on professional negligence. Peer review exists for a reason. It's the quality control mechanism that separates legitimate research from propaganda. For someone with Lex's claimed academic credentials, bypassing peer review is like a surgeon operating without sterilizing their instruments. You simply don't do it unless you know your work won't survive scrutiny. But here's the truly damning part. The paper's conclusions were overwhelmingly favorable to Tesla, painting their autopilot system as significantly safer than it actually was. The timing was perfect. Tesla was facing increased scrutiny over autopilot accidents, and suddenly this MIT researcher appears with data suggesting their system is actually remarkably safe. Real experts in the field immediately spotted the problems. The sample sizes were inadequate, the methodology was flawed, and the conclusions didn't follow from the data. But by then, it didn't matter. Elon Musk had already signal boosted the paper to his millions of followers, and Lex had established himself as a Tesla-friendly academic willing to provide scientific cover for corporate interests. This is where we see the true nature of Lex's operation. He's not a researcher seeking truth, he's someone willing to prostitute academic language and credentials to advance specific narratives. The Tesla paper wasn't research, it was marketing disguised as science. And it worked perfectly, launching Lex from complete obscurity to the podcast stratosphere almost overnight. The fact that this paper has been essentially memory hold, despite launching his career, tells you everything you need to know. Even Lex seems to understand it won't survive scrutiny, which is why it's become increasingly difficult to find archived copies of the criticism it received from actual experts. Let's talk about how someone goes from teaching community college classes to interviewing the world's richest man in under 20 episodes. This isn't organic growth, this is what happens when you provide valuable services to powerful people. After the Tesla paper, Elon Musk didn't just endorse Lex's work, he essentially adopted him as his personal podcast propagandist. Lex appeared on the Joe Rogan podcast specifically because of Musk's recommendation, and from that moment, his trajectory was sealed. What we're witnessing here is the manufacturing of influence through mutually beneficial deception. Musk needed academic credibility for Tesla's safety claims, and Lex needed a pathway to relevance. The Tesla paper was their joint venture. Lex provided the academic language and MIT association, while Musk provided the platform and credibility boost. But this relationship reveals something darker about how modern influence operates. Lex has essentially become Elon's unofficial spokesperson, consistently defending him even when Musk's behavior becomes indefensible. Watch any interview where Musk comes up, Lex transforms from his usual, neutral academic persona into a full-throated defender. This isn't intellectual honesty, it's the behavior of someone whose career depends on maintaining powerful relationships. The speed of Lex's rise makes sense only when you understand that he was filling a specific need in Musk's ecosystem. Musk needed someone who could articulate pro-Tesla, pro-Musk positions using academic language and credentials. Traditional academics wouldn't prostitute their reputations that way, but Lex had already demonstrated his willingness with the autopilot paper. This created a template that Lex would use repeatedly: identify powerful figures who need academic cover for controversial positions, provide that cover using his manufactured credentials, then leverage those relationships for access to even more powerful figures. It's influence laundering on an industrial scale. The Elon connection got Lex noticed, but the Joe Rogan appearance made him mainstream. And watching how Lex manipulated Rogan reveals just how sophisticated his deception really is. Rogan has a well-documented weakness for people who sound smart, especially if they confirm his existing biases about technology and consciousness. Lex understood this perfectly. He showed up with MIT credentials, speaking slowly and deliberately about artificial intelligence and the nature of consciousness, exactly the kind of pseudo-intellectual content that makes Rogan feel like he's having profound conversations. This is psychological manipulation at its finest. Lex studied Rogan's podcast and identified exactly what would make him seem impressive to both Joe and his audience. The robotic delivery that many people find off-putting actually works in his favor with Rogan's demographic. It sounds like what people think genius should sound like. But more importantly, Lex positioned himself as the smart guy, complement to Rogan's everyman persona. While Joe asks the obvious questions, Lex provides the technical explanations. While Joe focuses on physical pursuits, Lex represents intellectual achievement. It's a perfect symbiotic relationship, except it's built on false premises. The tragedy is that Rogan genuinely seems to believe in Lex's genius. He's repeatedly called Lex one of the most brilliant people he knows, not understanding that he's been deceived by someone who's essentially a more sophisticated version of a con artist. Lex exploited Rogan's intellectual insecurities and desire to associate with smart people, and in return, he gained access to one of the most influential platforms in media. Once Rogan endorsed him, Lex inherited legitimacy with millions of people who trust Joe's judgment about character and intelligence. This is how influence laundering works. You don't need to convince everyone individually, you just need to convince the right influencers, and they'll do the work of convincing their audiences for you. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of Lex's persona is his constant talk about love. He brings up love in every serious interview, positioning himself as the podcast equivalent of a spiritual teacher who just wants everyone to get along. This isn't philosophical depth, it's a sophisticated psychological operation designed to make him immune to criticism. By constantly positioning himself as the guy who believes in love and human connection, Lex creates a cognitive shield. How can you attack someone whose only agenda is spreading love and understanding? This is classic cult leader psychology repackaged for the podcast era. The love obsession serves multiple strategic purposes. First, it differentiates him from more aggressive masculine podcasters like Rogan, creating a unique niche as the spiritual intellectual. Second, it provides cover for his obvious biases. He's not pushing agendas, he's just trying to bring people together through love. Third, it makes criticism of him seem mean-spirited and small-minded. The mask slipped when Mark Maron revealed watching Lex scream at a hotel employee over a broken printer. This wasn't just a bad day, it was a glimpse of who Lex really is when the cameras aren't rolling. The love and understanding persona is performance art, carefully maintained for public consumption but abandoned the moment it's inconvenient. The most disturbing example was his interview with Ukrainian President Zelensky, where he seriously asked if Ukraine could forgive Russia with the power of love. This wasn't naive idealism, it was propaganda disguised as spiritual wisdom. He was essentially arguing that Ukraine should surrender to stop the violence, framing capitulation as enlightened forgiveness. When you watch that interview knowing what we know about Lex's background, it becomes clear that the love messaging isn't accidental. Someone whose country is being invaded, whose people are being killed, is being lectured about forgiveness by a guy whose career was launched by writing propaganda for a tech billionaire. The audacity is breathtaking, but it reveals the true purpose of the love persona, to advance specific political narratives while maintaining plausible deniability. For someone who constantly talks about free speech and open dialogue, Lex runs one of the most aggressively censored platforms in podcasting. His approach to information control would make authoritarian governments proud. Anyone who mentions his actual university gets blocked. Anyone who brings up the Tesla paper controversy gets blocked. Anyone who questions his credentials gets blocked. His Reddit community is so heavily moderated that critics had to create an entirely separate subreddit just to discuss him honestly. This level of information control reveals the true stakes involved in maintaining the Lex Fridman brand. He's not just sensitive to criticism, he's terrified of it, and with good reason. His entire career is built on maintaining specific narratives about his background and expertise. If those narratives collapse, everything else collapses with it. The blocking behavior is particularly telling because it's so comprehensive and systematic. This isn't someone having emotional reactions to trolls, this is strategic narrative management. Lex and his team have clearly identified specific topics and facts that threaten the brand, and they've implemented industrial-scale censorship to prevent those topics from gaining traction. What makes this especially hypocritical is that Lex regularly platforms free speech advocates and criticizes censorship by other platforms. He's built part of his brand on being the guy who has respectful conversations with people across the political spectrum, yet he won't tolerate even basic factual questions about his own background. This creates an information bubble where only approved narratives about Lex can exist in the spaces he controls. His audience literally cannot access contradictory information about him without actively seeking it out elsewhere, which most casual listeners will never do. It's information warfare conducted through social media management. Now we come to the theory that sounds like conspiracy but makes more sense than any alternative explanation, that Lex Fridman is functioning as some kind of intelligence asset, whether formally or informally. Consider the evidence. How does a boring, charisma-free podcaster with fake credentials gain access to world leaders that established journalists can't reach? How does someone go from teaching community classes to interviewing Benjamin Netanyahu, Jeff Bezos, and heads of state? How does he consistently get the first or most significant interviews with major tech figures? The intelligence asset theory isn't about shadowy government conspiracies, it's about recognizing how influence operations work in the modern era. Intelligence services don't just recruit spies anymore, they cultivate influence networks. And Lex fits the profile perfectly: someone with a large platform, manufactured credibility, and a demonstrated willingness to advance specific narratives regardless of their truthfulness. Whether he's a formal asset or just someone who's useful to certain interests doesn't really matter, the functional result is the same. He provides a platform for messaging that serves specific geopolitical and economic interests while maintaining the appearance of independent academic inquiry. Look at his guest list and the timing of certain interviews. He gets access to major tech CEOs right when they need positive coverage. He interviews political figures precisely when they need to reach his demographic. He platforms certain experts on geopolitical issues in ways that consistently favor specific policy positions. The most telling aspect is how he's managed to maintain this access despite having no real credentials or expertise. In legitimate journalism, access is earned through reputation, expertise, and track record. Lex has none of these things, yet he gets interview opportunities that established experts in relevant fields can't access. This suggests that his value to these figures isn't his audience or his interviewing skills, it's something else entirely. What Lex represents is something much larger and more frightening than individual fraud. He's a perfect case study in how expertise is manufactured and distributed in the digital age, and why our entire information ecosystem is vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. Lex succeeded because he understood that in the attention economy, appearing smart is more valuable than being smart. Most people can't distinguish between real expertise and performed expertise, especially when it comes to complex technical subjects. So Lex created a performance of intelligence that sounds convincing to people who don't have the background to evaluate it properly. He figured out that if you speak slowly enough, use enough technical jargon, and associate yourself with prestigious institutions, most people will assume you're profound. Add in some philosophical rambling about consciousness and love, and you've created the perfect pseudo-intellectual package for mass consumption. But the real genius was understanding how to leverage this manufactured credibility for access to actual power. By proving his willingness to use academic language to advance specific narratives, starting with the Tesla paper, he demonstrated his value to people who needed that kind of service. This created a feedback loop where his access to powerful figures enhanced his credibility, which increased his access to even more powerful figures. This is how influence laundering works in the modern era. You don't need to be an actual expert, you just need to be able to convincingly play one for the right audience. And once you've established that credibility, you can trade it for access, influence, and ultimately, real power. The most disturbing aspect is how well this system works. Lex has fooled millions of people, including other influencers who should know better. His success proves that our information environment is fundamentally broken. We've created systems that reward the appearance of expertise over actual expertise, and that makes us vulnerable to exactly this kind of manipulation. What we're looking at with Lex Fridman isn't just individual deception, it's a case study in how authentic expertise dies in the information age. Lex represents the triumph of performance over substance, marketing over merit, and influence over intelligence. But more than that, he reveals how our entire system of determining who to trust and what to believe has been fundamentally corrupted. Let's start with what Lex actually is: a mid-tier academic who figured out how to game the credibility system through strategic deception and relationship management. He's not uniquely intelligent, he's not particularly insightful, and he's certainly not the profound thinker his followers believe him to be. What he is, however, is exceptionally skilled at understanding and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities in how modern audiences process information about expertise. The foundation of his success lies in recognizing that most people, including highly successful people like Joe Rogan and Elon Musk, are surprisingly bad at evaluating intellectual credibility. They rely on shortcuts, prestigious institutional affiliations, academic-sounding language, and the confidence that comes from speaking slowly and deliberately about complex topics. Lex reverse-engineered these shortcuts and built his entire persona around triggering them. But here's what makes this so much more sinister than typical influencer fraud. Lex didn't just want attention or money. He wanted to become a node in the network of people who shape public opinion on critical issues. The Tesla paper wasn't just about getting famous, it was about demonstrating his willingness to use academic credibility to advance specific narratives, regardless of their relationship to truth. This willingness made him incredibly valuable to powerful interests who needed exactly that kind of service. They needed someone who could articulate their positions using academic language and credentials, someone who could make corporate propaganda sound like independent research, someone who could platform their preferred experts while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. And Lex delivered brilliantly. His podcast became a laundering operation for ideas and narratives that couldn't survive scrutiny in traditional academic or journalistic settings. By wrapping controversial positions in academic language and presenting them through his unbiased MIT researcher persona, he could mainstream ideas that would be immediately recognized as propaganda if presented directly. The love obsession plays a crucial role in this operation. It's not spiritual wisdom. It's psychological manipulation designed to make criticism of him or his guests seem mean-spirited and small-minded. When you question Lex's agenda or point out his deceptions, you're not engaging in legitimate criticism, you're being hateful towards someone who just wants to spread love and understanding. This creates a perfect shield against accountability. His audience has been conditioned to see criticism of Lex as evidence of the critic's moral failings rather than potential legitimate concerns about his credibility or agenda. It's cult psychology applied to podcast fandom, and it's been remarkably effective at insulating him from the consequences of his deceptions. The intelligence asset theory, whether literally true or not, captures something important about how influence operations work in the modern era. Traditional intelligence work focused on recruiting spies and stealing secrets. Modern influence operations focus on cultivating networks of people who can shape public opinion and policy discussions. Whether Lex is formally connected to intelligence services or just someone who's useful to certain interests doesn't change the functional reality of what he does. He provides a platform for messaging that consistently serves specific geopolitical and economic interests. He gets access to world leaders and tech executives that legitimate journalists can't access, despite having no real credentials or expertise. He consistently platforms certain experts and narratives while avoiding others, creating a skewed information environment that serves particular agendas. The timing of his major interviews, the nature of his access, and the consistent patterns in his editorial choices all suggest coordination with interests beyond simple podcast growth. Whether that coordination is formal or informal doesn't matter, the result is the same. His platform functions as an influence operation disguised as independent media. But perhaps the most frightening aspect of the Lex phenomenon is what it reveals about the vulnerability of our information ecosystem. We've created an environment where manufactured expertise can compete with and often defeat authentic expertise. We've made it easier to fake credibility than to earn it legitimately, and we've built distribution systems that reward performance over substance. This isn't just about Lex, he's part of a broader ecosystem of pseudo-experts who figured out how to monetize the appearance of intelligence and expertise. They've recognized that in the attention economy, being right is less important than sounding right, and being credentialed is less important than appearing credentialed. The success of figures like Lex creates a negative feedback loop that corrupts the entire information environment. Actual experts see that doing legitimate work and maintaining intellectual integrity leads to smaller audiences and less influence than creating viral content and building parasocial relationships with audiences. The incentives increasingly favor deception over truth-seeking. Meanwhile, audiences become conditioned to prefer content that makes them feel smart over content that actually informs them. Lex's success proves that millions of people would rather listen to someone who sounds profound talking about consciousness and love than someone who actually understands the technical subjects they're discussing. The most tragic aspect is how this affects young people who are genuinely interested in science, technology, and intellectual development. They encounter figures like Lex and assume that's what expertise looks like. They model their own intellectual development on pseudo-experts rather than actual experts, creating a generation that confuses performance with competence. Lex Fridman isn't just a podcaster with questionable credentials, he's a symptom of a much larger disease in how our society determines truth and distributes credibility. His success represents the triumph of manufactured expertise over authentic knowledge, influence operations over independent inquiry, and marketing over merit. The fact that he's been able to maintain his deceptions for years, despite extensive evidence being publicly available, proves that we've entered an era where audiences prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. And that preference is being systematically exploited by people who understand that in the attention economy, controlling the narrative is more valuable than discovering the truth. The Lex Fridman phenomenon should terrify anyone who cares about the integrity of public discourse. He's proven that with the right combination of manufactured credibility, strategic relationships, and psychological manipulation, someone with minimal actual expertise can become one of the most influential voices in technology and geopolitics. And if someone like Lex can pull this off, what does that say about our ability to distinguish between legitimate expertise and sophisticated fraud? What does it say about the reliability of our information sources, the trustworthiness of our public intellectuals, and the future of knowledge-based decision-making in democratic societies? These aren't just questions about one fraudulent podcaster, they're questions about whether we still have the intellectual infrastructure necessary to separate truth from propaganda in an age of unlimited information and sophisticated manipulation. And based on Lex's success, the answer should scare all of us.
They call me Brian Callahan. In this cruel world there is a man you should listen to as you journey on through life. His name is Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan. Shoulders for days and a really wide back. Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan. A barrel of snakes for a bag.
You fucked up. You should have never done that song. It was terrible.